Welcome to this episode of the Experience Project. Today we're tackling the really big topic of shelters. It's unlimited options and choices out there. It's just never ending. You can go super ultra light, you can go super robust and burly. Really, I think it all starts with identifying the type of hunting that you're going to be doing. So we could all, obviously everything here is backpack hunting, but that can look very differently depending on the style that you're doing, the location that you're in, and the time of year that you're hunting. First, we just got to identify that. If your intent is to go hike 3-4 miles in there, set up a base camp, hunt from there, you're in the lower 48, you could get by with just about anything. I would probably go with a larger shelter. You might as well have extra room, because the reality is if you've got a ultralight, 1.5 pound shelter versus a 4-pound shelter, you're talking 3.5 pounds that you've packed that 3 or 4 miles. That is not a deal breaker. You're going to have the benefit to that style of hunting where you set up a base camp is you're going to be, typically you're hiking in during the day, you're going to be able to have a lot of visibility, you're going to find a nice camp spot, you're going to make sure it's flat ground, it's protected, you got trees and shelter out of the wind, things like that. So really your shelter choice isn't super critical. How it pitches, does it take 5 minutes to pitch or 10 minutes to pitch, or just whatever. All those kind of decisions just get a lot easier when you're talking about just going in and set up in a base camp. How we've all evolved to hunt, and me and my circle of friends, Mark, we pack up camp every single morning regardless. What we have found is the amount of energy that you are saving by doing this is through the roof. Yes, you've got a heavier pack on you all day long because you're taking all of your camping gear with you, all of your food with you, but you're not going to and from camp every day. You're not ending up 2 miles away from camp and having to hike back in the dark. You're not having to wake up an extra hour early in the morning to get back to where you were the night before. You're just going to bed wherever the heck it gets dark, and you're just saving so much energy. So you've got the more weight on your back, but again, the energy savings is incredible. And we noticed a dramatic increase in, I would say, our efficiency in killing animals. We were killing animals much faster in trips. If it's a 5-day trip, it was day 1 or day 2 instead of day 4 or day 5, because we're just there. You're waking up exactly where you need to be. We have found, like elk hunting, more often than not, you're chasing elk, you're near elk, it gets dark, you run out of light, you set up right there. You're hearing bugles in the middle of the night, you're waking up, there's elk within distance of you. You're probably putting less scent out there than if you're traveling that 2 miles back and forth every day, just sleeping right where you're at. I've had numerous times you wake up and there's elk within 200 yards of camp, and it's like, well, they shouldn't be here because there's scent's here, but I don't know exactly what it is, but I've seen it more times than not. It's not something I'm really concerned about as far as like sleeping where the elk are. Obviously if I'm in an area that I think the elk are going to be, like, I'm not going to sleep in the middle of a meadow where I think the elk are going to be feeding that night. I'll go back 400 yards or 600 yards and find a place to sleep. But generally, it's not an issue. And again, we've become much more effective, much more efficient out there hunting, doing this style of hunting. Once you kind of start doing this style of hunting, all of a sudden there's a lot of factors that come into play on what matters. I have gravitated to the Bivy sack and tarp combination for its utmost in simplicity. I can sleep just about anywhere. More often than not, I'm just sleeping in the Bivy sack. These are the types of Bivy sacks we're using. This is a catabatic one. It's not a waterproof Bivy sack at all. It's just got a mesh from your waist up to your head for breathability and reducing condensation. So if it's a clear night, I've got my inReach with me, I've checked the weather, going, okay, it's not going to rain, I don't have to worry about it, then I will just find a flat spot, and you can sleep on a trail. If there's a game trail that's like 12 inches wide, you spend a few minutes, you kick it wider, you sleep right there. I love to sleep in kind of a tree well. If you got a pine tree, especially with the overhanging pine limbs, those seem to kind of catch the moist air in the night and you wake up completely dry. So sleeping under tree wells. I've slept in elk beds and deer beds where, again, just within a few minutes you can kick it out and make it a lot bigger, versus if you've got something, so this is like the extreme minimal footprint. Then you go to something like this is a HILLEBERG ANJAN 2, I'm gonna need a larger, I need a wider, I need a longer flat spot. And those are just tough to come by. If it's getting dark and you've got 30 minutes, you're in the middle of a mountain, you know, you're pulling up the topo on your phone, looking for benches and things like that, trying to find a flat place to sleep, or you may have to go to the top of the ridge to find a flat spot where you're potentially more exposed to weather, or you drop all the way back down into the creek bottoms where there's gonna be more moisture, more condensation in the morning. So again, having a shelter that doesn't require a large footprint is really critical to me, and that I can just sleep a lot more places. Yes, you forego some of the comforts. Do I wanna take a bivy sack when it's late season with high chance of snow and rain? No. These are all shelters that I owned or have owned. I borrowed a couple of them from some friends. The second part of this video, we're gonna take these outside, set them all up. I'm gonna walk through some of the features that I like, that I'm looking for in a shelter, depending on the type of shelter I'm with. And I do think, if you just had a bivy sack and tarp, I don't think that's a solution for every hunt all season. It's an amazing tool for 90% of the hunting I do, but there is a 10%, maybe 20% of the hunts I'm doing where I need something more burly, robust, again, better weather protection, things like that. I'm just gonna walk through. So this is bivy sack and tarp combined, 1 pound. This tarp is from a company called Jimmy's Tarps. They're no longer in business, but it's one I've got a lot of miles, a lot of nights in. And then this is the Catabatic bivy sack. This is what, they're trekking pole supported tents. So this is Outdoor Vitals 40th tent. So it has no structure to it. It's just fabric, and then it relies on 2 trekking poles and I believe 6 or 7 stakes to pitch. Really good all around option. I spent a couple nights in this last year. Used it on a spring bear hunt, and then used it on one hunt in the fall. Really like that. This is TARPTENT AEON Lee. So this is an example of a cuben fiber tent. They are incredibly lightweight. This whole thing weighs 15.6 ounces, I believe. It's a one-man shelter. One of the things that it has that I don't like is it's got structure that's sewn into the tent itself, into the tent body. So I can't take it and stuff it anywhere in a pack. It's not gonna crumble up. There's carbon rods that are sewn into it, and I'm limited on, it's taking up a lot more space in my pack than other shelters would, where I don't have to put them in a stuff sack and I can kind of push them into nooks and crannies of a backpack. But super lightweight. It's been a good all-around tent. Here in a minute I'll talk about materials as well. This is the TARPTENT Moment DW. This is my buddy Jason's. I owned one for a couple seasons. It is a brilliantly designed tent. It requires 2 stakes to pitch. Stakes are something that you don't really think about, but basically reducing the amount of stakes that is required to get a good pitch. And in my mind, like if there's a 0 wind atmosphere, or you're in the trees, or you're not worried about wind, it just requires 2 good anchor points to the ground. And for a non-freestanding shelter, it's pretty incredible. The downside to this tent that I didn't like was, one, it's really wide. So it's as wide as a 2-person tent, but it's only a 1-man tent. And when you get into that, you're talking about you got 30 minutes of light left, or it's dark, you're looking for a place to sleep. You know, it's harder to find that wide flat spot than it is somewhere to throw the bivy sack down. So it's one of those things where you're wasting a lot of time and energy and just kind of mental, you know, you've only got so much mental capacity out there. You want to get to camp, set it up, eat your meal, go to bed, and get some sleep, where, you know, these are just bivy sack and tarps, so easy to throw up real quick, versus this, you're going to have to hike around and find a flat spot to pitch. But really a brilliantly designed shelter as far as the geometry and how it sets up, and I think a great choice for a lot of guys, still relatively lightweight. Then you got the HILLEBERG ANJAN 2. HILLEBERG, I mean, quality-wise, when we're going to Alaska, it's kind of the default. That's what we need. To me, there's the lower 48, and then there's Alaska. Alaska is its own beast, way different weather, way harsher conditions, much higher chance of very high winds, prolonged 3-4 days of just constant pounding rain. And also the potential, you know, all of these hunts, well, the exception of the mountain goat hunt, we might be able to hike out. All the other ones, we're getting, you know, we're 100 to 200 miles away from the nearest town. We're flown in there. Your shelter is your lifeline. When I'm hunting Idaho, I don't care if it's August or December, I'm never more than 5 hours from my truck. So in the worst case scenario, I'm willing to gamble a little bit and take chances if the weather doesn't look great, because I know I can just hike out and get to my truck and be there and I'll be just fine. When you're in Alaska, you don't have that option most of the time. And I think, you know, investing in something like a HILLEBERG is absolutely worth it. It's like on the same level of having an inReach device with you. The safety aspect of a really well-built shelter is really critical. Talk about materials for a second. You've got, like, HILLEBERG is a nylon 6/6 sil material. So very strong, going to be relatively lightweight. You're a pound or 1 ounce, 1.2 to 1.4 ounces per square yard of fabric. Then I believe TARPTENT falls into that sil poly category where there's a polyester aspect to the fabric. Instead of nylon, it's poly. The benefit of poly is it doesn't stretch like nylon does. So when these kind of, the fabric will absorb a little bit of moisture. It will stretch out over the course of a night. So it'd be very common for guys to have a tent. They pitch their HILLEBERG or whatever it is. It's nice and tight. You go to bed. You wake up in the morning and the walls are all sagging in. Well, two things have happened there. One, it's kind of absorbed moisture, condensation sitting on the fabric. And two, the nylon material tends to stretch. Poly doesn't do that as much, but poly technically isn't as strong as nylon when you do like abrasion and tear tests and things like that. I mean, you're really splitting apples there on I don't know if you could really argue one's better than the other, because I think they're all well within the spec of being more than tough enough for what we're requiring out of these shelters. So you got nylon, poly, and then you move into DCF, cuben fiber, Dyneema. It's kind of had a few different names. It started out as cuben fiber and then they got bought out, and I think you generally call it DCF. It's super lightweight. So DCF generally runs at 0.5 to 0.8 ounces per square yard, where a good sil poly, sil nylon is going to be that 1.1 to 1.4, 1.5 ounces per square yard. So just in fabric weight alone, you could go from something that's, say, 1.4 ounces a square yard to 0.75 and save half the weight of fabric. Obviously, that's not half the weight overall, because you've still got guy lines and stakeout points and other parts of it, but just fabric alone, you're going to save a bunch of weight. DCF is going to be a lot more expensive. Obviously, along with this video, Mark and I talked for a couple hours on shelters through the podcast. Definitely, this is the short version of that long conversation with just some more physical examples. Definitely listen to that, but I think we looked up the pricing on a tarp tent, and it was $300 for a regular tent, with nylon or polyester, and then $600 for the DCF version. So double the cost. The raw material, the DCF, is just very expensive stuff. It's harder to work with, harder to sew. It requires some different techniques that make them a lot more expensive. So the upside, you save a bunch of weight. The downside, there's a couple of them. One, they don't pack up. This whole thing weighs 15 ounces. I mean, I could get it smaller in there, but you get a general idea. The fabric's got a lot more body, and if you compress it, it wants to expand back out. It's harder to get into a backpack, in my opinion. It's kind of a small example of like a down quilt versus a synthetic quilt. Like the synthetic is going to take up a lot more space. It's not going to compress. Cuben's kind of the same way. It's harder to compress up. And, you know, if you're like me, I'm always erring on the smaller the bag, the better. And a DCF shelter may, you know, if I decided this versus this, they're identical in weight, 1 pound, but this is going to take up half to maybe even less space in my pack than this was. So there could be a scenario where the DCF shelter is pushing you into a bigger bag. So you're saving weight here, but you're having to pack a bigger backpack with you. And there's obviously more weight and bulk there if you got to jump up a pack size. The other downside of cuben fiber is it's just a little bit noisy. And I've spent a lot of nights in DCF shelters. If it's raining outside, it's got more of that like rain on a tin roof kind of pinging sound, and it'll just kind of keep you up. Like you're laying there in bed and it's like, man, it's raining. It sounds like it's raining harder than it actually is. Where if you got nylon or polyester, it's like, oh, you can hear it raining, it's drizzling outside. Where this is like just magnifies it. So not a big deal. Just the potential to keep you up longer at night is certainly, you know, it's something to consider. Tent stakes. I set out some stakes here. There is, like, not all tent stakes are created equal. And what I generally do, this is a MSR groundhog stake. I found these things to be excellent. They really have a lot of gripping power. They're also a little bit heavier. You've got like lighter weight options here. This is an Easton stake. This is a DAC stake. Definitely going to be lighter in weight. I think this is just some cheap Amazon stakes I bought at some point. But what I do, I know it sounds silly because You know, if you're not worried about weight at all, you just pack however many of these are required for your tent. But what I do is I'll take, if I've got this Hilleberg ANJAN 2 that requires 4 stakes to pitch, so 2 at the toe end, 2 at the head end, that's like the minimum required for the tent to stand, and if no wind's blowing, it's going to be just fine. So I'll take 4 of those, and then for all the guy outlines, depending on if I'm in Alaska or Idaho, you know, I'm packing stakes for all the guy outlines or maybe just 1 or 2 extra. I'll run a little bit lighter stake there. It's a nerdy, geeky thing just to save half an ounce tops, but something that I do. I just, like I said, burly stake for your main connection points, lighter stakes for the others. And sometimes tent manufacturers, you know, they're designing this tent, they're trying to sell this tent, market this tent to, all right, it needs to weigh 2 pounds. Well, they design it and it weighs 30.5 ounces. So they only have 1.5 ounces for stakes. They might just give you 6 crummy small stakes, and you're going to be better off with going and jumping on, you know, Amazon or wherever and buying some bigger stakes for those connection points. Because when you're in soil conditions that are less than ideal, in your backyard, anything works. Staking down in a nice firm grass. When you're up in the mountains, it could be just shale, loose rock. It could be really loose ground. Plenty of times you're trying to stake in just like pine needle beds in a pine forest. So there's not a lot of grabbing power there, where having a better stake is really handy. Something else to talk about, which would come up a lot in discussions, is freestanding versus non-freestanding shelters. I've had enough experience with both at this point to say I don't care. A freestanding shelter is basically one where the pole structure, you basically put the poles into the tent and it just stands on its own. Maybe you got to stake out where the vestibule doors are or something like that, but generally it stands on its own. Where a non-freestanding HILLEBERG, ANJAN, actually all of these tents are non-freestanding tents. They require stake connection to the ground to be pitched. If 1 or 2 of the stakes fall out, then they're going to collapse in on itself. In practice, while freestanding sounds better, obviously it's going to be heavier because it's going to come with more poles to be able to create that structure. And in practice, I've just found that when I'm in soil conditions, loose rock, pine needles, stuff like that, where I can't get a good stake connection to the ground, I've always been able to improvise. There's always a tree or a bush to tie to, or you can take the guy line and within 50 yards of your camp, there's a couple big rocks. You grab them, you wrap the guy line around it, you throw it on the ground. If you're in snow, you take your guy line, you wrap it around the middle of your stake, bury that down in the snow about 1 foot deep, and then it's got to pull that whole stake out through the ground. That connection works really well at times. So just a little bit of know-how and ingenuity when you're out there, you can really bypass the whole freestanding versus non-freestanding option. One shelter I don't have on this table is a TIPI. In general, TIPIs kind of they're ideally suited for that base camp thing, in my personal opinion. I've spent a lot of nights in TIPIs through friends owning them and whatnot over the years. What I don't like about TIPIs is the footprint that they require. Again, when we're talking about packing up camp every morning and setting up on the side of mountains, TIPIs are very inefficient for the amount of room you get inside of them for the footprint that they require. I'm sure if you did a math calculation on it, it's going to be one of the worst ones by far, as far as, all right, I need 40 square feet of flat area to get a 2-person shelter versus I need 25 square feet. Depending on the country you're hunting in, generally Idaho, mountains, Alaska, mountains, flat spots are hard to come by, and that's why I don't like teepees a lot. They've got to be, yes, you're going to use a trekking pole, but there's some type of extender needed to get the geometry right, where your feet and your head aren't touching the sides, the bottom edges of the teepee. You got to go wide and you got to go tall with that center pole. And I've just found them not to be my favorite. They're fine. The concept of teepees with a stove for late season, I think there's a lot of validity to that. But again, I would never use one in a situation where I'm setting up and tearing down camp every single day. And I've also not had very good luck with them in high winds. Maybe that's just the ones I've used, but we've taken them, we had 2 teepees up on our second caribou trip up to Alaska in 2019. And both of them we ended up just taking down because they were blowing over. They require a lot, going back to like requiring stakes. Generally a 2-man one's going to be like 8 or 10 stakes that are required to pitch it. So you're really relying on that stake connection to the ground, and in high winds, it's just not ideal. So when it comes to Alaska, TIPI is 100% off of my radar on a hunt that's going to be exposed. Obviously, there are hunts where, you know, say a moose hunt down low in the brush, chances of really high winds are pretty low. But again, TIPI is not my favorite. I don't own one. They're not on this table for a reason for me. Next, I want to talk about just kind of the difference between 3 and 4 season tents. And really, there's not going to be substantial changes in the design. You can look at HILLEBERG, like go look at an ANJAN versus a NALO, and really what you're going to see is generally a little bit better pole structure, so maybe thicker poles, larger diameter poles. And then the biggest difference really is making sure that the tent fly goes all the way to the ground. Like an ANJAN is going to have what's called a cantonary cut. So basically between stake points at the ground, there's going to be kind of an arched cut to it. A lot of these shelters are going to have something similar to that. The upside to that is in the warmer temperatures, you're getting better ventilation, so that the gap between the ground and the fly, the air can pass through there, kind of reduce condensation in the tent. Downside is water's going to potentially get inside the tent. We had this happen. We had an ANJAN 2 on both the sheep hunts, Doll sheep hunts I've done up in Alaska, up in the Alaska range, and one night it was raining and the wind blowing hard from the one side that my buddy Tyler's whole sleeping bag was completely soaked on the kind of right edge of it because the rain was getting inside the tent. So something to pay attention to of, you know, in inclement weather, you want that tent fly as close to the ground as possible. The downside though is you're reducing airflow and you're reducing condensation. Condensation is obviously something that's annoying. Some shelters are better than others. Basically, you've got the moisture that gets inside the tent, the outside colder air, and then moisture develops on the fly of the tent. You talk about like basically a traditional tent, which has an inner tent and then outer shell to it. Condensation is the same regardless. It's just that because you've got that inner mesh tent, you're not actually coming in contact with it. To me, it's just one of those things you got to get over. Like there's going to be condensation. It's going to get your sleeve a little wet. It's annoying. I get it. I don't like it either. Just something, you know, I try to find a shelter that's big enough so I'm not brushing up against the edges when I'm sitting up in it and drinking coffee in the morning. But also, you know, you don't want so big that, again, you're going back to footprint and weight and size and things like that, that the shelter's getting too big. To reduce condensation, site selection really does matter. If you're next to a creek, you're going to have a lot of it. If you're out exposed to the clear night air above you, you're going to have a lot of it. I try to always get underneath something if I can. So elk hunting or whenever I can, I'm getting under tree limbs, under pine limbs. That really, really helps. And just getting away from, if you've got like a little drainage with a creek and there's a flat spot, but then you go 100 yards away and there's a little bench with another flat spot, just sleeping in those two different spots, the one up on that bench is going to have a lot less condensation. And it is nice when you're doing the style of hunting where you're packing up camp every single morning. You know, packing up everything soaking wet does get kind of annoying. You got to stop midday. At least I do this. If the sun's out, I'll stop midday. If I'm sitting there glassing or eating lunch, I'll take my tent fly out or take my quilt out and let those things dry out before I put them back in the pack. That way they're not in there wet, especially your sleeping bag or quilt where the down's kind of somewhat damp and getting compressed all day. So something to pay attention to, but also just one of those kind of, you just got to deal with it when you're out there hunting. It's one of those things that you can't entirely avoid, but you can make some better decisions than others on how to reduce that. So next part of this video, we're going to head outside. We're going to set up all these different shelters, and I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of what I like and what I don't like. If, you know, just like boots, I don't have the perfect shelter that exists for me yet. I think somewhere between the Bivy sack and tarp combination is an awesome setup that works for a lot of different situations, and somewhere in here is, you know, a perfect shelter for storm worthiness, be able to kind of go that 3+ 4 season route if I need to, be up in Alaska. Obviously, HILLEBERG is great quality for that stuff. So we're going to walk through all this stuff, talk through some features, tell you what I'm looking for, what I'm not looking for, and go from there. All right, well, we moved outside and we got everything set up here. Tarp, Bivy sack, I got the TARPTENT AEON Lee, I got a big AGNES Fly Creek, I got the TARPTENT Moment DW, and then the HILLEBERG ANJAN 2. Just gonna comb through these shelters real quick and talk about the things I like and dislike about them. So obviously the versatility of the Bivy sack and tarp. I have taken that, I take this setup or a Bivy sack, and I've run some different tarp options over the years, but the versatility of this to be able to sleep in the middle of nowhere, on a flat ground. Like Mark and I were packing out his bowl last year, and we got to this creek bottom. It's dark. We're in rough terrain. We didn't know how to get out of there. We were new to the country. And we just we got to a game trail, kind of flattened out by a creek. There was just enough room to throw the 2 bivy sacks. If we had had a Hilleberg ANJAN 2 on that hunt, the next day, I don't know where we would have had to have hiked for another 2 miles before we found a spot that we could have pitched that tent, versus just the ability to throw the bivy sack out on the ground. That versatility for the run and gun hunting. I'm packing up every morning. I can sleep in so many more places than needing a big footprint for a tent. So I really love it. Admittedly, it took me a couple years to get used to. I did not like it at first in this kind of exposed configuration. You don't have that warm, cozy feeling like you're safe from a grizzly bear because you're in a tent. You feel more exposed. But once I got used to it, all the pros way outweigh the cons of it. More often than not, just sleeping in the bivy sack. If the weather forecast calls for rain, then I can pitch the tarp. The versatility of the nylon fabric that can stretch, the length of the guy lines. I've taken a chunk of the corner of it, wrapped it around trees, wrapped it around bushes. I can really just pitch it as an over shelter a lot of the times, and make it work no matter where I'm at. So that's super awesome setup. Together with the bivy sack and tarp, you're right around a pound. And then obviously you got your trekking pole and some tent stakes. So ultimate versatility. Condensation's reduced when you're packing up in the morning because there's so much air going on here that it's really not a big issue. The alternative to this is, when we get to the Hilleberg ANJAN, we've done a bunch of hunts where we just take that shell. So if we do get in a pinch where it's going to rain, we've got a shell, but we still take the bivy sack. So we have that opportunity to have the versatility to sleep in a lot of different places, except if it's going to rain and we're going to have inclement weather. So moving on to the AEON Lee, this is the one shelter I have out here that's of the DCF material. So when I talk about noisier, it's just got a lot more noise. When the rain's hitting that, it's more of a rain on a tin roof type thing. It's a single trekking pole in the middle. One of the cool things about the shelter, and not cool things, is it's got structure sewn into it. So there's carbon fiber poles here, and then if you come along the backside, there's 2 poles on the ends, 1 in the middle, another 2 poles. So one of the disadvantages I don't like about this tent is that the carbon poles that structure is sewn into it. So when I'm rolling it up and putting it inside my backpack, it takes up a lot more space than I would like it to. You know, if you got a big pack and you got plenty of room, great. But again, I'm always telling people and myself, go smaller with your bag size. And so taking up space is something you need to consider. One of the things I do like though is if you come to this back edge, you can see how it's got a flat edge, and it makes it, when I'm in the mountains, if I have a flat spot, it gives me kind of that bivy sack appearance where I can tuck right up into something. It's oftentimes on the backside of a log, there's a nice flat spot I can throw this. So I really like a tent where I have a flat edge to it, especially if you're on a hill that's sloping down and you got a little bit of a flat spot. You don't have a bunch of tent wasted that's kind of sitting up on the hill. So something I really like. And then this is kind of that hybrid version where they use magnets, which is kind of cool. You've got essentially a single wall shelter, but then you've got a full mesh bug inner to it. So there's plenty of room to sit up inside of it. You got a DC floor, which is going to be 100% waterproof. A pretty small vestibule, I mean enough to pack and weapon there, but not a whole lot of extra space. But really for 15 ounces, it's a pretty good shelter. The last time I used this was in 2021 on a late season elk hunt. I knew I was going into a foot of snow. I wanted the completely waterproof floor because I knew I was going to be on top of like a foot of snow when I was pitching the tent that night. And it's also a very warm tent. It holds heat really well, and that night in particular was like 5 degrees for the high or for the low. Big Agnes Fly Creek, a good example of a freestanding tent, right? So I don't have the fly on it right now, but it's got its own structure. It is kind of nice it's obviously a real small footprint. And if I'm in the mountains and it's like, okay, here's a flat spot, I can just throw it down right on that spot, put the rain fly on. Obviously got to stake it out. It's a tent that I used a lot, and then I got sick of it being so small that I started trying bigger things. I actually moved from the Big Agnes to this Tarp Tent Moment DW, and then realized that was bigger than I wanted. But really a great all-around shelter. I didn't use it for years, and in the last few seasons I brought it out a couple times just to use. Real small vestibule. Obviously, you know, it's got a front entry, which is kind of annoying. You got to crawl in there, and then to get out, you got to sit up and spin around to get your boots on. Definitely a minimalist but lightweight freestanding shelter that is also warm. The fly comes to the ground pretty well and does a good job. I took it on the death hike this spring, actually, when we camped at the Grand Canyon. Tarp tent moment DW. This is a brilliantly designed shelter. It's got a lot of cool things going for it. The one thing that you can see from this angle is just how it's as wide or wider than the HILLEBERG ANJAN 2. So for a one-man shelter, super wide. The first season I had this, I was in Wyoming in Region G deer hunting, and where we're at, flat spots were just hard to come by. And early on, of figuring out, like, man, footprint matters. How big of a flat spot I need matters, so I can sleep up on the mountain, so we can wake up. We don't have to hike somewhere to a glassing point. We're at the glassing point, and that's where you go back to like a bivy sack. It opens a lot of versatility up. But it is really good shelter. I believe it's right around 2 pounds. And one of the, I think the coolest aspects of it is it just pitches with 2 stakes. You literally, one on that side, one on this side. You kind of pull it tight, set it in, stake it to the ground, and then you obviously got your guy lines, tensioners there to tension it and get it tight. Really, from that aspect, it's a really well designed shelter. And then on the inside, you've got your standard kind of big inner tent. So yeah, you can actually take this inner and slide it back and forth across the string that runs across the bottom here. And so if your flat spot is on that side of the tent or on this side of the tent, you can adjust that, which is pretty cool features that they have. This tent I know is 10 years old. Jason bought it in 2014 when we first had that Wyoming hunt. We bought them at the same time together. I believe they've made some updates to this. Really cool tent. Tarp tent does some really great designs. I would definitely take a look at them. Other couple things is it's got some good vents up here. There's one on the other side, and then down on the toe end to adjust ventilation. So you can, going back to what I was talking about, the 3-season, 4-season tents, you can really close this off, get the fly pretty close to the ground, make it a pretty warm tent, but also open it up and have a lot of air pass through and get a lot of ventilation on a warm night. Moving into the HILLEBERG ANJAN 2, another beautifully designed tent. This just requires, for being a 2-man tent and the size and weather resistance it has, it just requires 4 stakes. So you've got 2 on the head end, 2 on the toe end, and then you got your 2 arch pulls, pitches tight. The last few times I've used this tent, we just remove the entire inner, so that just, the whole thing just pops out like that, and you can take the entire inner tent out, and we just use it like a tarp. We use it as a shelter. We're up in Alaska. We got a lot of high winds and rain potential. We run our 2 bivy sacks on the inside. Then it actually opens up a lot of room because you got 3.5, 4 inches all the way around. It gives you an extra, 4 inches of height and 8 inches of width for 2 guys to sleep in there with lots of room. Plenty of room to store your gear up in the front. Really an awesome shelter. And then if you're in real extreme weather, then you go back to the inner. That inner solid fabric is going to really help retain warmth and heat in there and keep you warm. HILLEBERG's quality is unmatched. They're going to be the best when it comes to Alaska, high winds. When when your life depends on your shelter, HILLEBERG is definitely going to be my #1 choice. So that pretty much covers up shelters. We got everything from your 2-man absolutely bomb-proof HILLEBERG, which frankly, these days, I think you can get to about 3.5 pounds if you make it as light as possible, to, a great 1-man arch pole, freestanding, super light cuben fiber trekking pole tent to the Bivy and tarp. Really good rundown of all the options you have out there. I encourage you just to pay attention to the things we talked about. If you're running, gunning, you're packing up every morning, you want a smallest footprint as possible. Tents are no exception. There's a give and take. If I'm going to spend 3 days inside the tent because it's terrible weather outside, I want that to be a nice livable space, but nice livable space requires a larger footprint, more fabric, more weight. So you just got to weigh the pros and cons, what works for you and what doesn't. And then really, I think having an arsenal of 2 shelters like the bivy sack and tarp, and then one of these other ones to adjust on what's the weather forecast doing. Maybe both of them are in your tote in the back of your truck, and as you're heading in, you make a game time decision based off what the weather and the country looks like, to have your best shelter option for yourself out there on the hunt. Hopefully some of this information helps you on your next shelter decision. For more information, check us out at theexperienceproject.com.